Chapter 2, Unit 2, Networks of Exchange. 2.1 The Silk Roads. What the Silk Roads actually were, let's clear something up right away, because this is one of the most common traps students fall into on the AP exam. The Silk Roads were not a single road, not even close. Think of them less like a highway and more like a Wi-Fi network. Invisible threads connecting nodes across thousands of miles, with signals bouncing between cities, oases, mountain passes, and ports. The College Board uses the plural Silk Roads deliberately, and you should too. The term itself wasn't even coined until 1877 by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen. Ancient merchants didn't call it anything so romantic. They just knew which caravan to join and which oasis had drinkable water. The Silk Roads were a series of overland and maritime trade routes linking China, Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, East Africa, and the Mediterranean world. They were most active roughly between 200 BCE and 1450 CE, though the AP exam focuses most heavily on the period from about 200 BCE through 1450 CE, which spans Units 1 through 3. When you see a question about the height of Silk Road activity, think Tang Dynasty China, 6118 to 907 CE, and the Mongol Empire, 13th, 14th centuries. Those are your two golden eras. What actually moved along the Silk Roads? Here's a mental model that will save you on multiple choice questions. Silk was the headline act, but the supporting cast was just as important. From China flowed silk, porcelain, and paper. From Central and Southwest Asia came glassware, textiles, and horses. And those horses mattered enormously, because China was desperate for strong Central Asian horses to use in warfare. From South Asia came cotton, spices, and precious stones. From the Mediterranean came gold, silver, and olive oil. But here is the concept the AP exam loves to test more than any other in this section. The most transformative things traveling the Silk Roads weren't goods. They were ideas, religions, technologies, and diseases. Buddhism spread from South Asia into Central Asia, and then into China and East Asia along these routes. Islam later spread similarly. Paper-making technology moved west from China, mathematics and astronomical knowledge moved in multiple directions. And in the 14th century, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, traveled westward along the Silk Roads with devastating consequences, connecting directly to what you'll study in Unit 3. When an FRQ asks you to explain the significance of the Silk Roads, your most powerful evidence is always the cultural and intellectual exchange, not the merchandise. The role of Central Asian peoples and middlemen. One concept students consistently underestimate is the role of intermediaries. The average Chinese merchant didn't pack up a cart and walk to Rome. Trade moved in stages, passing through the hands of Sogdian merchants, Central Asians who were absolutely essential to overland trade, Arab and Persian traders, and eventually Mediterranean merchants. The Sogdians, in particular, based in cities like Samarkand and Merv, functioned like the logistics companies of the ancient world. They spoke multiple languages, maintained diaspora communities along the routes, and kept the whole system running. This matters for the AP exam because it connects to a recurring theme, the growth of merchant and commercial classes. The Silk Roads didn't just move goods. They elevated the social and economic status of traders in societies that had traditionally ranked merchants below farmers, priests, and warriors. In China, under Confucian social hierarchies, merchants ranked lowest of all, and yet the silk trade made some of them extraordinarily wealthy and influential. That tension between ideological ranking and economic reality is exactly the kind of nuance that shows up in document-based questions. Facilitating factors. Draw this in your mind. The AP exam expects you to understand not just what the Silk Roads were, but why they functioned when they did, and why they declined at other times. Think of it as a list of prerequisites for the network to operate. Political stability is first. When large empires, the Han Dynasty, the Parthian and later Sassanid Persian empires, the Roman Empire, and crucially the Mongol Empire controlled large stretches of the routes, trade flourished. The Mongol Pax Mongolica, roughly 1250 to 135 CE, is the single best example. For about a century, a traveler like Marco Polo could move from one end of Eurasia to the other under one political umbrella, with a kind of passport system and guaranteed protection. When empires fragmented, trade contracted. That's why the fall of the Han dynasty and the fragmentation of Rome both contributed to a quieter period for Silk Road trade in the 3rd to 5th centuries CE. File that cause and effect relationship away. It appears in both MCQs and SAQs. The second prerequisite is technology and infrastructure. Caravanserais, roadside inns that served as rest stops, marketplaces, and information hubs. Think of them as ancient truck stops/hotels, and on the maritime side, the mastery of monsoon wind patterns. Arab and Indian sailors figured out that the monsoons blow northeast in summer and southwest in winter, creating a predictable, cyclical engine for Indian Ocean trade. This maritime dimension connects directly to Section 2.3, the Indian Ocean Trading Network, so keep these two topics in conversation with each other. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. Let's be direct about where students lose points. Trap number 1, assuming the Silk Roads primarily connected China and Rome. They didn't. Rome was a peripheral player. The real centers of gravity were China, Central Asia, Persia, and India. Trap number 2, attributing the decline of the Silk Roads solely to the Black Death. The plague was a major disruption, but the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which influenced but did not simply block trade, and eventually the shift to sea-based routes in the 15th and 16th centuries all played roles. When an FRQ asks for causation, always offer multiple causes and explain how they interacted. For FRQ scoring, the College Board rewards you for contextualization. That means situating Silk Road trade within larger patterns like the general era of interregional connectivity beginning around 600 BCE or the demographic catastrophes of the 14th century. They also reward specific evidence, so you want proper nouns: Samarkand, the Han dynasty, Xuanzang. The Buddhist monk whose 7th century pilgrimage to India is a classic example of cultural exchange, and Ibn Battuta, whose 14th century travels demonstrate the Silk Roads in their later Islamic-dominated era. The final connection to hold on to: the Silk Roads don't disappear from the AP exam after Unit 2. They echo through the Mongol Empire in Unit 3, the Black Death and its demographic consequences in Unit 3, and the very reason European powers sought sea routes to Asia in Unit 4, because overland Silk Road trade was expensive, slow, and interrupted. Understanding 2.1 is essentially understanding the engine that drives the next two units. Speaking of sea routes, that brings us perfectly to what happens when traders take their networks off the road and onto the water, the Indian Ocean trading system and everything it made possible. 2.1a Goods, peoples, and ideas exchanged along the Silk Roads. The world's first internet. Imagine you're sitting in a coffee shop in Rome around 100 CE, and you're wearing a silk tunic, drinking wine spiced with pepper from India, and reading philosophy that traces its roots back to conversations happening simultaneously in Athens, Alexandria, and even as far east as the courts of Han China. You didn't build those trade networks. You didn't travel those routes yourself. But your entire world, what you wear, what you eat, what you think, has been shaped by them. That's the Silk Roads, not a single highway, but the ancient world's version of the internet, a sprawling, interconnected web of exchange that moved goods, people, and ideas across thousands of miles. Here's your first critical point for the AP exam. The College Board does not call it the Silk Road. They call it the Silk Roads, plural. This distinction matters because it signals something conceptual. There was no single road, no one route, no central authority managing it. The Silk Roads were a network of overland and maritime routes connecting East Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, East Africa, and the Mediterranean world. When you see an FRQ asking you to describe the characteristics of the Silk Roads, lead with complexity and decentralization. Students who describe it as one road lose nuance points immediately. What actually moved and what didn't. Now, here's the analogy that might save you on the AP exam. Think of the Silk Roads less like Amazon shipping and more like a game of telephone combined with a relay race. Most merchants didn't travel the entire route. A Chinese merchant might sell silk to a Central Asian intermediary in Dunhuang, who'd pass it to a Sogdian trader, who'd move it westward, eventually reaching Roman hands. Each leg of the journey added value, added cost, and critically added cultural mixing. Luxury goods dominated the exchange, and you need to know the specific examples. College Board loves from East Asia. China exported silk, hence the name, porcelain, and paper. From South and Southeast Asia came cotton textiles, spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cardamom, as well as precious stones. From the Mediterranean and Middle East came glassware, wine, olive oil, and gold and silver coins. From Central Asia came horses, and this is a detail that trips up students constantly. Central Asian horses, particularly the famous heavenly horses of Fergana, were considered so valuable by Han China that the emperor launched military campaigns specifically to obtain them. Horses weren't luxury trinkets, they were military technology. That's the College Board's kind of complexity. But here is the most important conceptual point about goods on the Silk Roads, and it appears in both MCQ and FRQ contexts constantly. Silk was not just a fabric. It functioned as a form of currency across Central Asia, as a diplomatic gift between rulers, and as a symbol of prestige that shaped political relationships. When the Tang dynasty sent silk westward as tribute to nomadic peoples, they were buying stability on the frontier. Understanding that goods carried political and cultural meaning beyond their material value is what separates a score of 3 from a score of 5. People as agents of exchange. The human dimension of the Silk Roads is where students often underperform. You must be able to name and explain specific groups of people as agents of exchange. The Sogdians are the College Board's favorite example, and for good reason. These Iranian-speaking merchants from the region of Sogdia, roughly modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, were the great middlemen of the ancient and early medieval Silk Road. They established diaspora communities all along the routes, from China to Persia, sending letters home, managing credit networks, and carrying not just goods but languages, scripts, and religions with them. When you see a document in an FRQ that references merchants or letters from Central Asia, think Sogdians. Pilgrims matter too. The Buddhist monk Xuanzang, who traveled from Tang China to India in the 7th century CE to retrieve Buddhist scriptures, is a perfect example of how religious devotion drove human movement along these routes. His journey, later mythologized as the classic Chinese novel Journey to the West, shows that people moved along the Silk Roads not just for profit but for faith, knowledge, and spiritual purposes. This connects directly to the idea exchange you'll read about next. Ideas as the most durable cargo. If goods were the obvious cargo and people were the vehicles, then ideas were the most durable and transformative thing the Silk Roads ever carried. The AP exam loves to ask you about the spread of religions along these routes, and you need to be precise about which religions spread where and when. Buddhism spread from its origins in South Asia into Central Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, largely through Silk Roads networks, particularly between roughly 100 BCE and 600 CE. Buddhist monasteries along the routes functioned like roadside inns and intellectual exchange centers simultaneously. The cave paintings at Dunhuang in western China are among the most powerful physical evidence of this spread, an oasis town covered in Buddhist art made by hands from a dozen different cultures. Christianity, in its Nestorian form, also traveled the Silk Roads eastward into Central Asia and China. Islam, after the 7th century CE, spread rapidly across these same networks, and by the time of the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries, Islamic merchants had become among the most active participants in Silk Road's trade. Beyond religion, technologies diffused across the routes. Paper-making spread from China westward into the Islamic world, and eventually Europe, transforming literacy and governance. Agricultural crops moved too. Citrus fruits, cotton cultivation, and sugarcane all relocated through these networks across centuries. Exam traps and connections. The most common MCQ trap is assuming the Silk Roads were primarily about silk or primarily about China. They were about the network itself, the connections. A question showing you a map of Central Asian trade routes and asking what best explains the significance is asking you to discuss connectivity, cultural diffusion, and the role of intermediaries, not just goods. Another common trap: students conflate the Silk Roads with the Indian Ocean Trade Network. Both are Unit 2 topics and both involve exchange, but the Silk Roads are primarily overland, with some maritime components, while the Indian Ocean routes are sea-based and rely on monsoon wind patterns. Keep those distinct. This topic connects forward to Unit 3, where you'll examine how the Mongol Empire revitalized and restructured Silk Road's networks, creating the Pax Mongolica that temporarily made long-distance travel safer. It also connects to the spread of the Black Death in the 14th century, which traveled precisely because those same trade routes were so well traveled. Exchange, as you'll see again and again in AP World, is never purely positive. It carries disease and disruption as readily as silk and philosophy. With that understanding of the overland Silk Roads firmly in your mind, let's turn to the sea, because the Indian Ocean Trade Network operated on a different logic entirely, one driven by seasonal winds and the maritime technologies that made them navigable. 2.1b Role of Oasis Cities and Relay Trade in Facilitating Silk Road Commerce. Setting the scene: the desert problem. Imagine you're trying to ship a package from Los Angeles to New York, but there are no roads, no trucks, no postal service, just a vast, hostile desert stretching for thousands of miles in every direction. How do you solve that problem? You find the oases, you find the rest stop. You build a network of waypoints where travelers can recover, resupply, and hand off their cargo to the next leg of the journey. That, in essence, is exactly what merchants and empires did along the Silk Roads between roughly 200 BCE and 1450 CE, and understanding how they did it is critical for your AP exam. The Silk Roads weren't a single road. College Board wants you to internalize this immediately, because one of the most common MCQ traps is treating the Silk Road as a single highway stretching from China to Rome. It was a network, a web of overland and maritime routes. And the overland network in particular depended on two interlocking systems: oasis cities and relay trade. These two mechanisms are the engine of Silk Road commerce, and you need to be able to explain them separately and together. Oasis cities, the lifeblood of the routes. An oasis city is exactly what it sounds like: a settlement built around a freshwater source in an otherwise arid or semi-arid environment. Think of places like Samarkand, Dunhuang, Kashgar, and Merv. These weren't just watering holes, they were thriving commercial and cultural hubs. Picture a modern airport layover city like Dubai. Travelers stop there, not just to refuel, but to shop, exchange currency, pick up local goods, share information, and absorb a little culture. Oasis cities functioned the same way, just with camels instead of jets. The AP exam will expect you to know specific oasis cities by name and to understand their geographic significance. Dunhuang, in northwestern China, served as the gateway between the Chinese heartland and the Taklamakan Desert, one of the most brutal stretches of terrain on the planet. Kashgar sat at the critical junction where northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan converged, making it one of the most important trading nodes in Central Asia. Samarkand, in modern-day Uzbekistan, became so wealthy from Silk Road commerce that it was considered one of the greatest cities in the medieval world. Merv, in modern Turkmenistan, was another critical hub connecting Persia, Central Asia, and South Asia. Here's the key conceptual point: oasis cities didn't just support trade, they actively shaped it. Merchants, goods, ideas, religions, and diseases all pooled in these cities before moving outward. That's why Buddhism spread from India through oasis cities into Central Asia and then into China. That's why Islam, originating in Arabia, spread so rapidly along these same corridors. The oasis city is where exchange, commercial and cultural, actually happened. For your FRQ, whenever you discuss Silk Road cultural diffusion, you should mention oasis cities as the mechanism by which ideas moved. That's a rubric point you can bank. Relay trade. Nobody goes the whole way. Now let's talk about relay trade, which is the second mechanism and arguably just as important. Here's another analogy. Think about how a relay race works. No single runner carries the baton the entire distance. They run their leg, hand it off, and a fresh runner takes over. Silk Road commerce worked almost exactly this way. individual merchants rarely, if ever, traveled the entire length of the route from China to the Mediterranean. Instead, a Chinese merchant might carry silk from Chang'an to Dunhuang, a Sogdian merchant, and you absolutely need to know the Sogdians for the AP exam, might then carry those goods across Central Asia to Persia. A Persian or Arab merchant might then move the goods westward toward Byzantine markets. The Sogdians are a group that College Board loves to test, and students consistently underestimate them. They were an Iranian-speaking people from the Samarkand region who dominated Central Asian trade for centuries. They were brilliant networkers who established merchant colonies all along the Silk Road routes, maintained their own language as a commercial lingua franca, and served as the indispensable middlemen of overland Eurasian trade. If an MCQ asks you which group was most responsible for facilitating Silk Road trade in Central Asia, the answer is almost certainly the Sogdians. Relay trade had profound consequences that the AP exam tests in multiple ways. First, it meant that goods changed hands many times, and each intermediary took a cut, driving up prices dramatically. Roman consumers paid enormous sums for Chinese silk precisely because it passed through so many hands. Second, it meant that most merchants had deep expertise in a specific leg of the route, not the whole network. Third, and this is a nuance that trips up students on the FRQ, relay trade meant that cultural and technological diffusion could happen even without direct contact between distant civilizations. Rome and Han China had almost no direct diplomatic or cultural relationship, yet goods, diseases, and ideas flowed between them through intermediaries. When you're writing about how the Silk Roads facilitated exchange without direct contact, relay trade is your explanation. Common traps and FRQ precision. Watch out for a classic MCQ trap. The question will describe a merchant traveling the full length of the Silk Road and ask you to identify what's accurate. The answer that says relay trade meant merchants typically covered one leg of the journey is almost always correct, not the option suggesting individual merchants made the full trip. Another trap involves conflating the goods traded with the people trading them. Silk moved from China to Rome, but no single Chinese merchant walked into Rome carrying it. For FRQ responses, the College Board rubric rewards specific evidence. Don't just write merchants traded along the Silk Road, write Sogdian merchants facilitated relay trade across Central Asia, connecting Chinese and Persian commercial networks through oasis cities like Samarkand and Merv. That's the level of specificity that earns points. Connections to other units. This topic threads beautifully into Unit 3, where you'll examine how the Mongol Empire, by unifying much of Central Asia, dramatically reduced the dangers of overland travel and revitalized Silk Road commerce. The Mongols didn't invent the network. They inherited the oasis city infrastructure and relay trade system and made it more efficient. You'll also see connections to Unit 2's broader themes of disease transmission. The Black Death traveled along exactly these relay networks, and to the spread of major world religions, particularly Buddhism and Islam, which piggybacked on commercial routes through oasis cities. With oasis cities and relay trade firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to zoom out and look at how the maritime routes of the Indian Ocean created their own equally dynamic commercial ecosystem, which is exactly where we're headed next. 2.2. The Mongol Empire and the Making of the Modern World. The world before the storm. Let's set the scene. Imagine it's the early 1200s. The Silk Roads are humming, but they're fragmented. Dozens of kingdoms, caliphates, and city-states control different stretches of the route, and trading across Eurasia is like trying to ship a package through 15 different courier companies, each with their own fees and rules. Then, out of the steppes of Central Asia, comes one of the most dramatic reshapings of the world map in human history. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory, they rewired the entire nervous system of the Afro-Eurasian world. And for the AP exam, understanding how and why that happened is absolutely essential. Chinggis Khan and the rise of the Mongol Empire. Temujin, the man who would become Chinggis Khan, meaning universal ruler, unified the disparate nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe by around 1206. This is your anchor date. Before unification, these tribes were in constant conflict with each other, which limited their collective power. Chinggis changed that by creating a meritocratic military structure, meaning officers were promoted based on skill rather than birth, a radical idea in a world defined by inherited status. Think of it like a startup that hires the best engineers, regardless of pedigree, outcompeting old slow corporations built on nepotism. The Mongol military success rested on several pillars the AP exam loves to test. Their cavalry-based armies were extraordinarily mobile. They could cover distances that sedentary armies simply couldn't match. They adopted the best military technology from every people they conquered. Chinese siege weapons, Persian engineers, you name it. This is a critical concept called military adaptation, and it's a direct example of how cross-cultural interaction accelerates change, a theme the College Board emphasizes throughout Unit 2. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating and where most students either nail the AP exam or lose major points. After the brutal conquests, and you need to acknowledge the violence, the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, ending the Abbasid Caliphate, and their campaigns killed millions. The Mongols established what historians call the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, stretching from China to Eastern Europe under a single political umbrella. This era from roughly the mid-1200s to the mid-1300s created conditions for unprecedented long-distance trade and cultural exchange. Think of the Pax Mongolica like a giant interstate highway system suddenly being built across a continent of dirt roads. The roads themselves didn't move the goods, people did, but the infrastructure made it possible. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and ideas could now travel from the Pacific coast to the Mediterranean, with a degree of safety and predictability that hadn't existed before. The Mongols established the Yam system, a network of relay stations across their empire that provided fresh horses and supplies to official travelers, functioning essentially like a pony express, stretched across a continent. This is a specific detail that appears on both MCQs and as evidence in FRQ responses. Know its name and function. Trade, disease, and the Black Death. Now, here's the edge case that absolutely appears on the AP exam, and it trips up students every single time. The Mongol trade networks were a double-edged sword. Yes, they facilitated goods like silk, spices, and paper moving across Eurasia. Yes, they spread technologies like gunpowder and the magnetic compass westward. Yes, they enabled cultural and religious exchange. Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity all traveled these routes. But the same connected world that carried Marco Polo from Venice to China also carried the bubonic plague. The Black Death, which devastated Eurasia beginning in the late 1340s, traveled along Mongol trade routes from Central Asia westward. This is one of the most important unintended consequences arguments you can make on an FRQ. The College Board wants you to recognize that increased connectedness brings both benefits and costs. This is a theme that runs straight from Unit 2 all the way through Unit 7 when you're studying globalization. The Mongols didn't cause the plague biologically, but their infrastructure enabled its spread at a scale and speed previously impossible. Do not confuse correlation with causation here, but do connect the two clearly. Cultural and technological diffusion. One of the most testable concepts in this section is the role of the Mongols as facilitators of diffusion rather than originators of culture. The Mongols themselves adopted the religions, administrative systems, and cultural practices of the peoples they conquered. In Persia and the Middle East, the Ilkhanate converted to Islam. In China, the Yuan dynasty adopted Confucian bureaucratic practices. This is sometimes called cultural syncretism, and it's a key term the AP exam uses. The Mongols were like a great mixing bowl. They stirred together Persian, Chinese, Islamic, and European elements in ways that produced genuinely new cultural forms. Specific examples to have ready for your FRQ evidence pile: the spread of papermaking and printing technology westward, the diffusion of Chinese artistic styles into Persian manuscript traditions, and the transmission of agricultural crops and farming techniques across regions. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler of the 14th century, was only able to journey from Morocco to Mali to Persia to China because the world the Mongols built made such travel conceivable. AP exam traps and FRQ scoring points. The most common MCQ trap is confusing the extent of Mongol impact with universal transformation. Not all regions were equally affected. Sub-Saharan Africa and Western Europe were on the periphery of direct Mongol control, yet felt indirect effects through trade disruption and disease. If a question asks which region was most directly transformed by Mongol rule, your answer should point to Central Asia, China, Yuan dynasty, Persia, Ilkhanate, or Russia, Golden Horde, not Western Europe or the Americas. For FRQ purposes, the scoring rubric rewards you for making a historically defensible claim, providing specific evidence like the Yam system, the Black Death's spread, or Ibn Battuta's travels, and explaining the significance of that evidence, not just naming it, but arguing why it matters. The Mongols are one of the College Board's favorite examples for the theme of networks of exchange, and they test your ability to argue both continuity and change. Trade routes existed before the Mongols, but the scale, speed, and integration of exchange changed dramatically. Connections across the course. Keep this topic linked in your mind to Unit 1's Silk Road Foundations, Unit 3's Cross-Cultural Interactions, and Unit 4's Emergence of a More Integrated Atlantic World, because the Mongols essentially created the proof of concept that a truly interconnected Eurasian world was possible. That precedent echoes forward through every subsequent era of globalization you'll study. With the Mongol trade networks woven firmly into your mental map, you're perfectly positioned to zoom in on one of the most important specific routes those networks supercharged, the Indian Ocean trading system, which we'll explore next. 2a. Pax Mongolica and its effects on trade and communication. Let's talk about one of history's most fascinating paradoxes, a period of relative peace and flourishing trade brought about by the most feared conquerors the world had ever seen, the Mongols. You might be thinking, wait, the people who destroyed cities and left pyramids of skulls created a golden age of commerce? Yes, exactly. And understanding how that happened is absolutely essential for scoring a 5 on your AP exam. What the Pax Mongolica actually was. The term Pax Mongolica, Latin for Mongol peace, refers roughly to the period between 1250 and 1350 CE, when the Mongol Empire controlled such a vast swath of Eurasia that overland trade routes became remarkably safe and efficient for the first time in history. Think of it this way. Imagine if one company owned every highway, rest stop, and toll booth from Los Angeles to New York. Suddenly, cross-country shipping becomes a lot more predictable. That's what the Mongols did, but across the entire breadth of the Eurasian landmass. After Genghis Khan's initial campaigns of conquest, brutal, devastating, world-altering, and after his successors consolidated power into 4 major successor states called the Khanates, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia, the empire settled into administration. The College Board wants you to know that this political unification under Mongol rule created the conditions for the dramatic expansion of the Silk Roads. The key phrase you'll see on the exam is facilitated exchange. The Mongols didn't invent the Silk Roads, but they dramatically facilitated exchange along them. The mechanics of Mongol trade facilitation. Here's where you need technical precision, because the AP exam will test you on the specific mechanisms. The Mongols instituted a system called the Yam, a sophisticated relay station network stretching across the empire. Imagine it as the Pony Express scaled up to continental proportions. Riders and merchants could move with unprecedented speed because fresh horses and supplies were available at regular intervals. Marco Polo, whose travels you absolutely need to know, credited this system extensively in his accounts of China. Merchants also received something called a peza, essentially a passport or safe conduct tablet, often made of gold, silver, or iron, depending on the bearer's rank, that granted protection and hospitality across Mongol-controlled territories. This is a detail that appears in MCQs more than you'd expect, so lock it in. The peza meant that a Venetian merchant like Marco Polo could travel from the Mediterranean, to the court of Kublai Khan with a reasonable expectation of not being robbed or murdered along the way. That was genuinely revolutionary. The Mongols were also religiously tolerant by the standards of their era, which matters for trade because merchants of different faiths, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Jewish, could operate across the empire without systematic persecution. This religious pragmatism kept the commercial ecosystem diverse and functional. Effects on trade, communication, and cultural diffusion. Now let's build outward, because the effects of the Pax Mongolica ripple into almost every other topic in Unit 2. The reopening and security of the Silk Roads dramatically increased the volume and variety of goods moving between East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Silk, spices, porcelain, and paper moved westward. Horses, glass, and silver moved eastward. But here's what the AP exam emphasizes above the goods themselves. Ideas, technologies, and diseases also traveled these routes. Chinese innovations, gunpowder, printing, paper money, diffused westward during this period. Islamic astronomical and mathematical knowledge moved in multiple directions, and critically, so did something nobody wanted, the bubonic plague. The Black Death, which you'll encounter again in Unit 2's discussion of disease exchange, spread westward along Mongol trade routes in the 1340s, almost certainly originating in Central Asia and reaching Europe by 130-47. The AP exam loves connecting the Pax Mongolica to the Black Death precisely because it illustrates that the same networks that carried silk and spices also carried pathogens. Integration has costs. Common MCQ traps and how to avoid them. This is where students lose points, so pay close attention. The most common trap is overstating Mongol originality. The Mongols did not create the Silk Roads. Those networks existed for over 1,000 years before Genghis Khan was born. What the Mongols did was reunify, protect, and intensify existing routes. If an answer choice says the Mongols established the Silk Roads, it's wrong. A second trap involves chronology. The Pax Mongolica is a 13th and 14th century phenomenon. Students sometimes confuse it with earlier periods of Silk Road activity, like the Tang dynasty's cosmopolitanism in the 7th through 9th centuries. If a question places Pax Mongolica before 1200 CE, something's off. Third, don't confuse the Pax Mongolica's effects with the effects of the Mongol conquests themselves. The conquests were enormously destructive. Baghdad, the intellectual capital of the Islamic world, was sacked in 1258 and the Abbasid Caliphate destroyed. The Pax Mongolica describes what came after the conquests, once administration replaced warfare. The exam sometimes presents scenarios where you need to distinguish between these two phases. Connections to other units and FRQ scoring points. For your FRQs, particularly the long essay question or document-based question, the Pax Mongolica is almost always relevant when you're discussing causes of cross-cultural exchange, continuity, and change in Silk Road networks, or the spread of disease. The College Board's rubric rewards complexity. So if you can argue that the Pax Mongolica both expanded trade and created the conditions for catastrophic pandemic spread, you're demonstrating exactly the kind of nuanced causation that earns complexity points. This topic connects directly to Unit 1's discussion of Dar al-Islam and existing Indian Ocean trade networks, showing how land and sea routes were complementary systems. It connects forward to Unit 3, where European exploration partly arises from the desire to find new routes after Mongol power collapsed and overland trade became dangerous again. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is often cited in this context. When the Ottomans cut off easy overland access, European powers had additional incentive to seek sea routes to Asia. Finally, remember that Ibn Battuta's travels in the 14th century, though primarily through Islamic regions, overlap with the late Pax Mongolica period and demonstrate the same principle: a well-connected world enabled by political stability and shared infrastructure. The Pax Mongolica, in short, is your lens for understanding how political power shapes the flow of commerce, culture, and yes, even catastrophe. And that lens is going to serve you well as we turn next to the Indian Ocean trade networks and the remarkable maritime world that connected East Africa, Arabia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia into one of history's most dynamic commercial systems. 2b Mongol conquest, destruction, and political reorganization across Eurasia. Let's talk about the most dramatic disruption to happen to the medieval world, the Mongol conquests. If you've been following along in Unit 2, you know we're deep in the age of interconnected trade networks, and the Mongols are perhaps the single most important force in reshaping those networks between roughly 1206 and 1368. Whether those networks were torn apart or stitched back together depends entirely on who you were and where you lived. And that nuance is exactly what College Board loves to test. The rise of Chinggis Khan and the mechanics of conquest. Start here in 1206. A man named Temujin unified the fractious nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppe and took the title Chinggis Khan, meaning universal ruler. Think of it like a startup founder who managed to merge every competing company in an industry into one unstoppable corporation. The Mongols had always been formidable fighters, but Chinggis turned military talent into a system. Their cavalry was fast, disciplined, and adaptive. They adopted siege technology from the peoples they conquered, Chinese engineers, Persian craftsmen, and turned those tools against the next city on the list. This is an important point for the exam. The Mongols succeeded because they integrated conquered people's skills, not despite dealing with them. The key dates you need to anchor this narrative are 1206, unification, the fall of the Jin dynasty in northern China by 1234, the sack of Baghdad in 1258, and the Mongol defeat at Ain Jalut in 1012-60, which marks the limits of westward expansion into the Islamic world. College Board expects you to know these as turning points, not just trivia. Destruction, the real costs of conquest. Here's where students often fall into a trap. Some exam questions try to get you to overstate Mongol destruction as the only story, while others try to get you to understate it. The truth is uncomfortable and important. The destruction was genuinely catastrophic in certain places. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 ended the Abbasid Caliphate, a political and cultural center that had existed for 5 centuries. Contemporary accounts describe the Tigris River running black with ink from destroyed manuscripts. The population of Iran is estimated to have dropped by as much as 75% in some regions due to warfare, famine, and plague. Central Asian cities like Samarkand, Merv, and Nishapur were devastated. This is not exaggeration. It was one of the most lethal series of military campaigns in pre-modern history. The AP exam will sometimes give you a source from a contemporary Muslim or Persian scholar describing absolute horror and ask you to evaluate its perspective. Your job is to contextualize it. Yes, this author had direct reasons to portray the Mongols as destroyers, and yes, the destruction was real, but you also need to acknowledge what came after. Political reorganization, the Mongol successor states. After the initial conquests, the Mongol Empire didn't stay unified for long. By the mid-13th century, it fragmented into 4 major successor states called khanates, and this is the political reorganization College Board wants you to map clearly in your mind. Think of it as a family business that split into 4 franchises after the founder died. The Yuan dynasty, founded by Kublai Khan, controlled China and East Asia. The Ilkhanate controlled Persia and parts of the Middle East. The Chagatai Khanate dominated Central Asia, and the Golden Horde controlled the Pontic steppe and Russian territories. Each of these khanates developed differently, and that divergence is crucial. The Yuan dynasty adopted Chinese administrative practices, using a merit-based bureaucracy and even patronizing Confucian scholars to some degree, while simultaneously favoring foreign merchants and administrators like Marco Polo's patron, Kublai Khan himself. The Ilkhanate eventually converted to Islam by the early 1300s, which tells you something profound about how the conquered culture absorbed the conquerors over time. For the FRQ, if you're asked about political reorganization, make sure you name at least 2 khanates, explain their geographic scope, and identify one way each adapted to local conditions. That specificity is what earns rubric points. The Pax Mongolica and trade networks. Here's the concept that ties this section back to Unit 2's central theme. After the violence came the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Once you control an enormous swath of Eurasia from China to Eastern Europe under a single authority, even a fractured one, trade becomes dramatically safer. The Silk Roads, which had always existed but been politically fragmented, were now protected by a single overlapping network of Mongol-controlled waypoints, postal relay systems called YAM, and legal protections for traveling merchants. Goods, people, ideas, and unfortunately diseases could now move across Eurasia with unprecedented speed and scale. This is the direct connection to Unit 2's broader argument about cross-cultural exchange. The Mongols didn't create the Silk Roads, but they turbocharged them. The YAM system is a detail that impresses graders. It was essentially a Pony Express across a continent, allowing messages and goods to move thousands of miles in days rather than months. The common MCQ traps to watch for. The biggest trap is treating the Mongols as either purely destructive or purely beneficial. Every AP exam cycle includes questions designed to test whether you can hold both truths at once. A second trap is confusing the Khanates. Don't mix up the Golden Horde with the Ilkhanate, and don't say the Yuan dynasty controlled Persia. A third trap is claiming the Mongols spread Islam, when in fact the Ilkhanate converted to Islam. The direction of influence matters. Finally, watch for questions that attribute the spread of the Black Death to trade routes and ask you to connect this to the Mongol period. The Pax Mongolica facilitated the plague's movement along the Silk Roads in the mid-14th century. This is a direct cross-unit connection to Unit 3's discussion of epidemic disease. Connections across the course. The Mongol conquests ripple through the rest of AP World History in ways you'll want to track. In Unit 3, the Black Death spread via Mongol-connected trade routes reshapes Eurasian demographics. In Unit 4, the collapse of Mongol authority contributes to the fragmentation that eventually encourages European maritime exploration. If overland routes become less stable, sea routes become more attractive. And the Yuan dynasty's fall to the Ming dynasty in 130-68 sets up a Chinese foreign policy that initially included massive maritime expeditions under Zheng He before turning inward, a story you'll encounter in Unit 3 and Unit 4 both. When you think about the Mongols on exam day, remember this framing. They were simultaneously the greatest destroyers and the greatest connectors of the medieval Eurasian world, and your ability to articulate that tension with specific evidence is what separates a 3 from a 5. With the Mongol world now mapped in your mind, we'll turn next to how the trade networks they disrupted and supercharged looked on the ground, the goods, the routes, and the peoples who moved along them in the Indian Ocean and beyond. 2.3 Exchange in the Indian Ocean region. The world's first global highway. Imagine you could stand on a beach in 9th century East Africa and watch ships arrive carrying silk from China, spices from Southeast Asia, and cotton cloth from India, all within the same trading season. That's the Indian Ocean Trade Network. And, for your AP exam, you need to understand it not just as a list of goods, but as a living, breathing system that shaped civilizations, spread religions, and created the first truly interconnected world economy. Let's build that picture together. The Indian Ocean Trade Network is arguably the most important commercial system you'll study in AP World History Modern. It predates the famous Silk Roads on land, it outlasts the Atlantic trade system that comes later, and it serves as the connective tissue between nearly every Unit 2 topic on the exam. College Board wants you to understand why this network existed, how it functioned, who participated, and what consequences it produced, especially cultural and religious diffusion. The monsoon engine, nature as infrastructure. Here's the key insight that unlocks everything else. The Indian Ocean Trade Network runs on wind. Specifically, it runs on the monsoon system, and understanding this is non-negotiable for the AP exam. Think of the monsoons as a seasonal conveyor belt. From roughly April through September, the southwest monsoon pushes warm, moisture-laden winds from the Indian Ocean towards South Asia and East Africa, meaning ships sailing northeast get a free ride. Then, from October through March, the northeast monsoon reverses direction, carrying ships back southwest. Merchants didn't fight the ocean. They scheduled their lives around it. This is your first major AP concept to lock in. Monsoon winds created predictable, seasonal sailing routes. This predictability is what made large-scale, long-distance trade viable centuries before GPS or engine power. Sailors using lateen-rigged dhows, those triangular sailed ships you'll see in AP documents, could navigate thousands of miles by reading the wind calendar. If an MCQ asks you why Indian Ocean trade was so extensive compared to Atlantic trade in the same period, your answer traces back to the monsoons. The Atlantic didn't have an equivalent seasonal wind reversal system until European sailors learned to exploit the trade winds much later in Unit 4. A common wrong answer trap on the exam is attributing Indian Ocean trade success primarily to government policy or a single empire's control. Resist that. Unlike the Silk Road, which required political stability across Central Asia, the Indian Ocean network was decentralized by design. No single empire controlled it, and that's actually a feature, not a bug. Trade continued even when empires rose and fell. Key players and port cities. Now, let's populate this highway with people. College Board expects you to know the major participants and their roles. Arab and Persian merchants, often called dhow traders, dominated much of the early network. Indian merchants, particularly from Gujarat on India's northwest coast, were among the most active commercial players across the whole system. Chinese merchants became increasingly significant, especially after the Song dynasty's maritime innovations and the later Mongol-era connections you'll see in 2.1. The port cities are just as important as the merchants themselves. Think of port cities as the charging stations of the ancient trade network, places where ships stopped, goods transferred, cultures mixed, and ideas spread. Calicut and Quilon on India's Malabar coast, Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, Aden in the Arabian Peninsula, Kilwa and Mombasa on the East African Swahili coast, and Malacca in Southeast Asia. You should be able to place these on a mental map and explain what made each one commercially valuable. Kilwa, for instance, became extraordinarily wealthy because it served as the gateway for East African gold and ivory flowing into the Indian Ocean system. When Ibn Battuta visited in the 14th century and called it one of the most beautiful cities in the world, he was describing a place made rich entirely by its position in this trade network. The Swahili coast is a favorite AP exam topic because it beautifully illustrates cultural synthesis, the mixing of Bantu African, Arab, and Persian influences that produced a distinct language, architectural style, and Islamic identity. Don't make the mistake of describing Swahili culture as simply African or simply Arab. College Board explicitly rewards nuanced answers that recognize hybrid cultural forms. What moved and why it mattered. The goods themselves tell a story. Luxury goods dominated, silk and porcelain from China, cotton textiles from India, spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves from Southeast Asia, gold and ivory from East Africa, and horses from Arabia. But here's the conceptual point that earns you points on FRQs. These were not just commodities, they were vectors of cultural exchange. When Arab merchants settled in Indian port cities to wait out the monsoon season, they built mosques. When those mosques attracted local converts, Islam spread. When Chinese porcelain arrived in East Africa, local elites used it to display status, embedding Chinese aesthetics into Swahili identity. This is why College Board frames Indian Ocean trade under the broader theme of networks of exchange, rather than just commerce. The exam will frequently ask you to identify both the cause and the consequence of contact, and your strongest answers will link the economic mechanism, monsoon-driven trade, to the cultural outcome, religious and artistic diffusion. Diasporic communities, the people who stayed. One concept that shows up repeatedly in AP exam prompts is the trading diaspora, communities of merchants who settled permanently in foreign port cities while maintaining their distinct cultural identities. Indian merchants in East Africa, Arab merchants in Southeast Asia, Chinese merchants throughout the whole network. These diaspora communities created long-term cultural enclaves that accelerated the spread of language, religion, and technology. Think of it like an international neighborhood in a modern city. People integrated economically while preserving cultural distinctiveness. When you see a document from a merchant community describing laws or customs that differ from the surrounding population, you're looking at diaspora evidence. Exam precision points. For the FRQ, remember that College Board's rubric rewards specific evidence over general claims. Don't write goods were traded across the Indian Ocean. Right, Chinese porcelain and silk moved southwest via monsoon winds to East African Swahili coast cities like Kilwa, where local rulers displayed them as status symbols. That's the difference between a 3 and a 5. Watch out for the chronology trap. Students sometimes confuse the Indian Ocean network with the Atlantic system. Indian Ocean trade is ancient and medieval. This is your Unit 2 content. The Atlantic system is Unit 4, 15th century onward. They overlap briefly in the late 1400s when Portuguese sailors entered the Indian Ocean, which is exactly where Unit 4 picks up the story. With the Indian Ocean's monsoon rhythms and trading diasporas firmly in mind, you're perfectly positioned for the next topic, because the same logic of interconnection and cultural exchange is about to play out on land as we turn to the overland networks of the Silk Roads. 2.3. Monsoon wind patterns and their role in enabling Indian Ocean trade. Let's talk about wind, not the kind that ruins your umbrella on a Tuesday morning, but the kind that literally built civilizations, launched empires, and connected half the world's population for over 1,000 years. The monsoon wind system of the Indian Ocean is one of the most consequential natural phenomena in all of human history, and the College Board knows it. You will see this on your AP exam probably more than once, so let's make sure you truly understand it, not just memorize it. What exactly is a monsoon? Here's the core concept, and I want you to picture this clearly. The word monsoon comes from the Arabic word masim, meaning season. That etymology is your first clue. Monsoons are predictable, seasonal wind reversals. They don't blow randomly. They flip direction on a reliable schedule, almost like nature's own calendar. During the summer months, roughly April through September, winds blow from the southwest across the Indian Ocean toward South Asia and East Africa. During the winter months, roughly October through March, those winds reverse and blow from the northeast back the other way. Why does this happen? Think about what happens when you open a car door on a hot summer day. The air rushes out of the car toward you, from hotter to cooler. That's essentially what's happening at a continental scale. In summer, the Asian landmass heats up much faster than the surrounding ocean, creating a massive low-pressure zone over land. Cool, moisture-laden air from the ocean rushes in to fill that void. That's your southwest monsoon, bringing rain to South Asia and making the headlines every June. In winter, the dynamic flips. The land cools faster than the ocean, high pressure builds over Central Asia, and dry winds blow outward from land toward the sea, your northeast monsoon. This is the elegant engine behind everything. The trading calendar of the Indian Ocean world. Now, here's where this becomes a history lesson rather than a meteorology lecture. Merchants in the ancient and medieval Indian Ocean world weren't just aware of the monsoons. They built their entire commercial calendar around them. Imagine you're an Arab merchant in Aden, circa 1100 CE. You load your dhow with textiles and silver in November, catch the northeast monsoon blowing from Arabia toward India, arrive in Calicut or Quilon on the Malabar coast a few weeks later, trade your goods for pepper, cinnamon, and cotton cloth, and then wait. You wait for the winds to reverse in April or May, catch the southwest monsoon home, and arrive back in Arabia by summer. The whole round trip was governed by nature's timetable. This waiting period is actually crucial for your exam. Merchants didn't sail against the monsoon. That would be fighting physics. Instead, they established diasporic communities, meaning permanent or semi-permanent settlements of foreign merchants in port cities along the trading routes. Arab merchants in Indian ports, Indian merchants in Southeast Asian ports, Chinese merchants in Malaccan ports. These communities formed because sailors had to wait out the season. Those waiting periods became the foundation for cultural exchange, intermarriage, religious diffusion, and the spread of languages. When you see an AP exam question asking why Islam spread so effectively across the Indian Ocean basin, the monsoon trading calendar is a central part of your answer. Key port cities, and the geography you must know. For the AP exam, you need to be able to place the major nodes of this system. On the western end of the Indian Ocean, Aden and Hormuz served as crucial entrepôts. That's a French word the College Board loves, meaning a trading post or transit hub where goods are stored and redistributed. Moving east along the Indian subcontinent, The Malabar coast ports like Calicut and Quilon were the source of spices and cotton textiles. Further east, the Strait of Malacca was the bottleneck connecting the Indian Ocean system to the South China Sea, and Malacca itself became perhaps the single most important commercial city of the 15th century. Quilon, Hormuz, Aden, Calicut, Malacca, know these names cold. What the AP exam actually tests here. Let me shift into exam prep mode because this is where students often drop points. The most common MCQ trap you'll encounter goes something like this. A question will describe the expansion of Islam or Buddhism into Southeast Asia and ask for the primary mechanism of that spread. Wrong answer choices will include military conquest or missionary activity. The correct answer, in the context of the Indian Ocean world, is almost always merchants and trade networks, facilitated by, you guessed it, the monsoon wind system. The winds didn't just carry cargo, they carried ideas, religions, languages, agricultural products, and diseases. A second trap involves chronology. The monsoon-driven Indian Ocean trade network was not a product of European exploration. Students sometimes conflate Vasco da Gama's 1498 arrival in India as the beginning of Indian Ocean trade. That is deeply wrong, and the exam will test whether you know it. Arab, Indian, Malay, and Chinese merchants had been using these routes for centuries before any European showed up. Da Gama famously hired an Indian navigator, likely Ahmad ibn Majid, to guide him across the ocean, because the knowledge was already sophisticated and well established. The Portuguese didn't invent this system, they inserted themselves into it, often violently. For FRQ responses, especially the document-based question and the long essay, the College Board is looking for you to use specific vocabulary: monsoon, dhow, entrepot, diasporic community, Indian Ocean trade network. When you write about the spread of Islam in this period, connect it explicitly to the monsoon trade calendar and merchant settlements. When you discuss commodities, name them: silk, spices, porcelain, cotton, ivory, gold. Specificity earns points, vagueness loses them. Connections across the course. This topic is a thread that runs through multiple units. In Unit 3, when you study the expansion of Islam, the Indian Ocean trade network is the vehicle. In Unit 4, when European powers begin their oceanic expansion, the Indian Ocean is the prize they're competing for, and understanding why it was so valuable requires understanding the monsoon-based system that preceded European arrival. In Unit 5 and 6, industrialization and new maritime technologies gradually disrupted these ancient patterns. The monsoon trade network is not a standalone topic. It is the connective tissue of the entire pre-modern global economy. Think of the monsoon winds as the original internet infrastructure, an invisible, reliable, predictable system that allowed information, goods, and culture to travel at speeds that seemed almost miraculous to those living outside the network. Once you see it that way, everything else in the Indian Ocean world starts to make sense. With a firm grasp of how wind patterns shape the rhythm of Indian Ocean commerce, we're perfectly positioned to zoom in on the specific goods, peoples, and cultural transformations that flowed along these routes, which is exactly what we'll explore next. 2.3b. Key port cities and their roles, e.g., Calicut, Hormuz, Malacca. Why port cities are the beating heart of the Indian Ocean network. Imagine you're planning a road trip across the country. You don't just drive nonstop, you stop at gas stations, diners, and rest stops along the way. Those stops aren't just convenient, they're absolutely essential. Without them, the trip doesn't happen. Now scale that up to the medieval and early modern Indian Ocean world, and you have the story of port cities. They weren't just dots on a map, they were the engine rooms of global commerce, and the AP exam loves them. The College Board places port cities at the heart of Unit 2 because they demonstrate how exchange networks actually functioned in practice. Understanding Calicut, Hormuz, and Malacca isn't about memorizing geography, it's about understanding how geography, trade goods, political power, and cultural exchange all converged in specific places and why those places mattered more than others. The logic of the entrepot. Before we dive into individual cities, you need to lock in one concept that will unlock everything else: the entrepot. An entrepot, and the College Board uses this term, so write it down. is a trading hub where merchants gather to buy, sell, and exchange goods without those goods necessarily being produced locally. Think of it like an airport layover city. Dubai didn't grow spices or weave Chinese silk, but for centuries a version of Dubai served as the place where those goods changed hands. Port cities in the Indian Ocean network worked exactly this way. Merchants from China, India, Arabia, and East Africa would converge at these hubs, offload cargo, wait for monsoon winds to shift, and then reload for the next leg of their journey. That last detail, the monsoon winds, is crucial for the example. The Indian Ocean trade system was fundamentally organized around the monsoon cycle. Southwest monsoons blow from roughly April to September, carrying ships from Africa and Arabia toward India and Southeast Asia. Northeast monsoons from about October to March reverse the flow. Merchants had to wait out the off-season somewhere, and that waiting transformed port cities into cosmopolitan, multicultural hubs. When you see an FRQ asking about the social or cultural effects of Indian Ocean trade, this is your mechanism. Merchants stranded for months created diasporic communities, spread religious ideas, married locally, and left their cultures behind. Calicut, the pepper capital of the world. Calicut, on the southwestern Malabar coast of India, is the city you absolutely must know for this section. Think of it as the Amazon warehouse of the medieval spice trade, specifically black pepper. The hinterland behind Calicut produced pepper in enormous quantities, and the city's rulers, the Zamorins, were shrewd enough to keep Calicut open to all merchants without imposing heavy tariffs. That free trade policy made Calicut irresistible to Arab, Chinese, and later European traders. You've probably heard of Vasco da Gama. When he arrived in Calicut in 1498, he wasn't discovering something new to the locals, he was crashing a party that had been going on for centuries. Arab merchants, many of them Muslim, had long dominated the trade there, and they weren't thrilled. Calicut illustrates a critical AP concept, the role of diasporic merchant communities. Arab merchants built mosques, settled permanently, and acted as cultural intermediaries. When the exam asks how Islam spread through the Indian Ocean network, Calicut is your case study. Merchants, not armies, carried the faith. A common MCQ trap here is to assume Calicut itself produced all the goods it traded. It didn't. Calicut was a collection point, an entrepot, for goods from the wider Malabar region. Don't confuse the city with the source of production. Hormuz, the gateway between worlds. If Calicut is the warehouse, Hormuz is the toll booth. Situated on an island at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, Hormuz occupied one of the most strategically important choke points on Earth, a position modern Iran still occupies today with the Strait of Hormuz. Every ship moving goods between the Mediterranean world, the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and broader Indian Ocean had to deal with Hormuz. The city was extraordinarily cosmopolitan. Contemporary accounts describe it as filled with merchants from every corner of the known world. Hormuz illustrates something the exam tests frequently: how political control of a strategic location translates into enormous wealth and power. The rulers of Hormuz didn't need to produce or farm anything. They taxed everything passing through. This is worth connecting to Unit 3 and the land-based empires. Control of trade routes was a fundamental source of imperial revenue and power, whether you were the Ottomans controlling the western end of the Silk Roads or the rulers of Hormuz sitting astride the Persian Gulf. Be alert to chronology here. Portuguese forces captured Hormuz in 1515, which is an important example of how European maritime expansion, Unit 4, disrupted existing Indian Ocean trade networks. That's a classic cross-unit connection. The FRQ rubric will reward you for making Malacca, where east meets west. Malacca sits on the narrow strait between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, another geographic choke point that made its controller fabulously wealthy. If you wanted to move Chinese porcelain, silk, or tea westward, or move Indian textiles and spices eastward, your ship passed through the Strait of Malacca. The city became the premier entrepot of Southeast Asia and, at its height in the 1400s, reportedly hosted merchants speaking over 80 languages. Malacca's story also demonstrates the spread of Islam through trade rather than conquest. The Malaccan ruler converted to Islam in the early 15th century, largely to build better relationships with Muslim, Arab, and Indian merchants. This is the AP exam's favorite mechanism for explaining Islam's spread in Southeast Asia: commercial incentives, not military force. Don't fall into the trap of thinking religious conversion in this era was always about belief alone. It was often deeply practical and politically motivated. The Portuguese captured Malacca in 1511, just as they had targeted Hormuz as part of their strategy to seize control of the Indian Ocean trade network. Again, file that cross-unit connection away for Unit 4. Connecting to the bigger picture. When the AP exam asks you about any of these cities, remember the framework: location at a geographic choke point or near a production region, anthropofunction, monsoon-dependent timing, multicultural merchant communities, and religious and cultural diffusion as byproducts of commerce. These same patterns repeat across the Indian Ocean world and connect directly to the Silk Roads in Unit 2 and to European expansion in Unit 4. As we move forward, you'll see how these port cities didn't just exchange silk and spices. They exchanged ideas, diseases, and technologies too, which brings us directly to the broader cultural and biological consequences of Indian Ocean exchange. 2.3c Role of Dhow Technology and Chinese Junks in Maritime Trade. Let's talk about ships, because if you want to understand how the medieval world was stitched together into one enormous web of exchange, you have to understand the vessels that made that stitching possible. Think of dhows and Chinese junks the way you'd think of the internet today. They weren't just tools for moving stuff from point A to point B. They were the infrastructure of globalization. And without them, the entire network of exchange that defines Unit 2 simply doesn't exist. The dhow in the Indian Ocean world. The dhow is the signature vessel of the Indian Ocean Trading Network, and when the College Board asks you about maritime technology in this period, roughly 1114-50 CE, the dhow is almost always central to the answer. Here's what you need to know about its design, and more importantly, why that design mattered. Dhows were built using a technique called lateen rigging, a triangular sail mounted at an angle to the mast. Picture a right triangle standing on its longest side. That triangular shape was a revolution in naval engineering because it allowed sailors to sail into the wind, not just with it. Before lateen sails, you could only travel when the wind was conveniently blowing in your direction. With lateen rigging, you could tack, meaning you could zigzag at angles into the wind, the way a skier goes back and forth down a slope. This transformed the Indian Ocean from a seasonal superhighway into a year-round road. The other critical design feature is that dhows were sewn, not nailed. The wooden planks of the hull were bound together with coconut fiber rope, a material called coir, rather than iron nails. This sounds fragile, but it was actually genius. Sewn hulls were flexible, meaning they could absorb the stress of ocean swells without cracking. Iron nails, by contrast, would rust in salt water and could cause planks to split. This is the kind of detail that shows up on multiple-choice questions. So hold on to it. The sewn hull construction of dhows was a feature, not a flaw. Dhows operated in partnership with the monsoon winds, the seasonal wind patterns that reverse direction twice a year over the Indian Ocean. Merchants would ride the southwest monsoon from East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula toward India and Southeast Asia in the summer months, then catch the northeast monsoon home in winter. This is why AP exam questions sometimes ask you to connect dhow technology to the regularity and predictability of Indian Ocean trade. The monsoons provided the schedule, and the dhow provided the vehicle. Arab, Persian, Indian, and Swahili merchants all mastered this rhythm, and it created the dense commercial culture of port cities like Calicut, Hormuz, Kilwa, and Malacca. The Chinese junk and the South China Sea. Now let's cross to the other end of Asia, because Chinese junks represent an entirely different engineering tradition, and a far more powerful one by the time you hit the early 15th century. The junk was a larger, more technologically sophisticated vessel than the dhow, and understanding why it dominated East and Southeast Asian waters is key to understanding Chinese commercial and political power in this period. Junks used battened sails, rectangular or trapezoidal sails reinforced with horizontal wooden or bamboo strips called battens, which look like the ribs of a fan. These battens let sailors adjust the sail's shape with remarkable precision, and they could be furled, folded up, quickly in dangerous weather. Think of it like a Venetian blind versus a bedsheet. The blind gives you control, the bedsheet just flaps. Junks also featured multiple masts, watertight compartments in the hull, an innovation that meant a hole-in-one section wouldn't sink the whole ship, and crucially, the magnetic compass, which Chinese sailors were using for navigation by the 11th century. When you combine watertight compartmentalization with compass navigation and large cargo capacity, you have a vessel that can go farther, carry more, and survive worse conditions than almost anything else on the water. The high point of Chinese maritime power in your period is Zheng He's voyages, 1405 to 1433, which you absolutely must connect to junk technology. Zheng He commanded fleets of massive treasure ships, the largest junks ever built, reportedly over 400 feet long, that sailed to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa. These voyages were not primarily commercial in the European sense. They were diplomatic expeditions projecting Chinese imperial power and collecting tributary relationships, but they demonstrate the full capability of junk technology. The fact that China voluntarily stopped these voyages after 1433, due to internal political debates about cost and Confucian suspicion of maritime commerce, is one of the great what-if moments of world history and a common FRQ theme. Exam, traps, and connections you cannot miss. Here's where students lose points. Don't confuse the purpose of the two vessel traditions. Dhows were primarily commercial, operated by private merchants within established trading networks. Chinese junks, especially the treasure ships, were state-sponsored and served political as well as commercial purposes. The College Board loves to test whether you understand this distinction. Another common trap is assuming these technologies were isolated. They weren't. Arab merchants sailing dhows regularly visited Chinese ports, and Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, flowed constantly through dhow networks into East Africa and the Middle East. When you describe the Indian Ocean Network, you're describing a system where dhow technology and junk technology intersected, not two separate worlds. For your FRQ responses, think about causation and continuity. Both technologies enabled the expansion and intensification of existing trade networks. That's your College Board language right there. They didn't create trade from nothing. They accelerated and extended networks that already existed. Strong AP essays note that port cities like Calicut and Malacca grew because these vessels could reliably bring large volumes of goods. Weak essays just say ships helped trade happen. This topic connects directly forward to Unit 4, where European caravel technology, which actually borrowed the lateen sail concept from Arab and Indian Ocean sailors, begins displacing these older networks. Understanding what dhows and junks could do helps you understand exactly what Europeans were competing against and later disrupting when they entered the Indian Ocean world. Now that you've got a solid picture of how maritime technology shaped the Indian Ocean and East Asian networks, let's zoom out and look at the land-based counterpart, the Silk Roads and the networks of overland exchange that connected Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. 2.4 Trans-Saharan Trade Routes. Setting the stage, the world's most unforgiving highway. Imagine you're trying to build a business route across a stretch of land the size of the continental United States, but it's almost entirely desert. Temperatures swing between freezing nights and scorching days, and there are essentially no gas stations, restaurants, or Google Maps. That was the challenge facing merchants crossing the Sahara Desert for over 1,000 years, and yet they pulled it off spectacularly. The Trans-Saharan Trade Network is one of history's most remarkable logistical achievements, and for the AP exam, it's also one of the most concept-dense topics in all of Unit 2. Let's walk through everything you need to know. The camel, technology that changed everything. Before the 1st century CE, crossing the Sahara was essentially impossible at scale. The Mediterranean world and sub-Saharan Africa were effectively cut off from each other commercially. Then came what historians call the Camel Revolution. The domestication of the Arabian camel, specifically the introduction of the North African camel saddle around 300 CE, transformed the Sahara from a barrier into a highway. Think of the camel as the semi-truck of the ancient world. It could carry up to 600 pounds, go days without water by storing energy, not water, in its hump, and walk comfortably on sand that would destroy wheeled carts. When you see an AP exam question asking what enabled trans-Saharan trade to flourish, the answer is always technological. Camel domestication and the camel saddle. Don't fall into the trap of saying horses. Horses were far less suited to desert conditions and were actually traded as luxury goods along these routes, not used as transport animals. The geography and the flow of goods. The routes themselves ran roughly north to south, connecting the Maghreb, North Africa, and the Mediterranean coast to the Sahel region, that semi-arid band just south of the Sahara, and onward into the forests and kingdoms of West Africa. The College Board wants you to know the major trading cities by name. Timbuktu, Djenné, and Gao were the great commercial hubs on the southern end. On the northern end, cities like Sijil Massa in Morocco served as the Mediterranean entry points. Picture it like an hourglass. Goods from across the Mediterranean and Middle East funneled down through North Africa, squeezed through the desert corridors, and then spread out into West Africa and beyond. What was being traded? This is critical for both MCQs and FRQs. Moving southward into West Africa came salt, copper, textiles, horses, and eventually manufactured goods from the Islamic world. Moving northward came gold enslaved people, ivory, and kola nuts. The gold for salt exchange is the exam's favorite example of complementary resource distribution. West Africa sat atop the Bambouk and Bur goldfields, among the richest in the medieval world, while the Sahara contained massive salt deposits at places like Tagaza. Salt was literally as valuable as gold in some regions because without it, you cannot preserve food or sustain basic body chemistry. That analogy lands with students every time. If refrigeration doesn't exist, salt is survival technology. The rise of West African empires. Here's where the political history locks in. The AP exam expects you to understand that control of these trade routes was the engine that powered the great West African empires. Ghana, roughly 6th, 13th centuries, Mali, 13th, 15th centuries, and Songhai, 15th, 16th centuries. These were not passive participants in trade. They were sophisticated states that taxed goods moving through their territory. The Ghana Empire, for instance, taxed both imports and exports of gold and salt, essentially functioning as a toll booth on the world's most lucrative highway. When you think about why these empires rose and fell, follow the trade. Ghana declined partly because the Almoravid movement disrupted its roots and political control. Mali rose because it captured the goldfields directly under Sundiata Keita. Mansa Musa, Mali's most famous ruler, made his legendary 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca with such an enormous entourage and so much gold that he literally crashed the Egyptian gold market for a decade. That single anecdote tells you everything about how wealthy these trade networks made West African rulers. Islam travels, the roots. One concept that earns points on almost every FRQ touching this topic is the diffusion of Islam along trade networks. Muslim merchants from North Africa brought their faith southward, and over time, West African rulers converted to Islam for deeply practical reasons. It gave them credibility with North African and Middle Eastern trading partners, access to Arabic literacy for record-keeping, and membership in a vast international commercial network. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage is the perfect example. It simultaneously demonstrates Islamic practice, the wealth of Mali, and the connectivity of the Afro-Eurasian world. Connect this to your continuity and change over time, CCOT skills. The spread of Islam via trade is a pattern that appears in Unit 2 across multiple regions, from the Indian Ocean to the Silk Roads. Common MCQ traps and FRQ answers. Let me flag the mistakes that cost students points most often. First, don't confuse the Ghana Empire with the modern nation of Ghana. They're geographically distinct. The medieval Ghana Empire sat in what is today southern Mauritania and western Mali. Second, students often misattributed the decline of these empires to a single cause. The AP rewards nuanced answers that acknowledge multiple factors like drought, internal political fragmentation, and shifting trade routes. Third, watch out for questions that ask you to distinguish trans-Saharan trade from Indian Ocean trade. Both spread Islam and connected distant regions, but the trans-Saharan network was predominantly overland, camel-based and gold-oriented, while the Indian Ocean network was maritime and spice-oriented. For the document-based question or long essay, your strongest arguments about trans-Saharan trade will center on three themes: the role of technology, camels, in enabling exchange, the political and economic consolidation of power by West African states, and the cultural diffusion, especially of Islam, that accompanied commerce. If you can deploy all three in a single well-organized response with specific evidence, you're on your way to full mark. Connections across the course. Trans-Saharan trade doesn't exist in isolation on the exam. College Board explicitly wants you to draw comparisons to the Silk Roads and Indian Ocean networks as parallel systems of exchange from the same period. All three spread religions, technologies, and diseases. All three required specific geographic or technological enablers, and all three were disrupted and reshuffled by the Mongol conquests and later the Black Death, topics you'll encounter in Units 3 and 4. Keep that comparative framework in your back pocket. It's the connective tissue of the entire networks of exchange unit. With the Saharan routes now mapped in your mind, let's head east and explore the maritime highways of the Indian Ocean, where monsoon winds replaced camel saddles as the defining technology of long-distance commerce. 2.4 Commodities exchanged: gold, salt, enslaved people, and key trading cities, e.g., Mali, Timbuktu. The lifeblood of medieval Africa. Why trade made empires. Let's set the scene. Imagine you're living in West Africa around the year 1200 CE. You're sitting on an almost incomprehensible amount of gold, more gold than most of the known world has ever seen in one place. But here's the cruel twist. Your region has almost no salt, and without salt, you can't preserve food, you can't season anything, and over time, you literally cannot survive. Meanwhile, somewhere to the north, across the Sahara Desert, people are sitting on massive deposits of salt, the kind that gets mined in slabs like bricks, but they desperately need gold to fuel their economies and trade networks stretching into the Mediterranean world. That tension, that perfect economic complementarity, is what drives one of the most important trade systems you need to understand for the AP exam, the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. The College Board wants you to see trade not just as merchants swapping goods, but as a civilizational engine. The commodities exchanged along these routes, gold, salt, and enslaved people, shaped the rise and fall of entire empires, influenced the spread of Islam, and connected sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and ultimately Europe. This isn't trivia. This is the skeleton of medieval world history. Gold and salt. The twin engines of West African wealth. Gold came primarily from the Bambuk and Bir gold fields in the western Sudan region, and later from the Akan fields further south. When AP exam questions reference West African gold, they're talking about a product so abundant that West Africa was supplying somewhere between half and two-thirds of the Old World's gold supply during the medieval period. Think about what that means economically. It's as if one region controlled the global oil supply today. Gold gave West African rulers enormous leverage, and it funded the military expansion, administrative bureaucracies, and monumental architecture of successive empires. Salt, on the other hand, came primarily from the Saharan mines at Tagaza and later Todeni. Here's an analogy that makes this stick. Think of salt in the medieval world the way we think of refrigeration today. Without it, meat spoils, food becomes dangerous, and populations can't grow. Salt was so valuable in sub-Saharan Africa that Arab travelers reported it being traded pound for pound against gold, a detail the AP exam loves to test because it illustrates how value is determined by scarcity and context, not by some inherent property of the material itself. That concept connects directly to Unit 3 and Unit 4 when you're analyzing the global silver trade or the spice trade. The same logic of regional scarcity creating explosive exchange value applies every time. One trap students fall into on the MCQ section is assuming that gold was always worth more than salt everywhere. Wrong. Value was relative and regionally determined. In the gold-rich forests of the South, where salt was almost impossible to get, salt commanded extraordinary prices. In North Africa, where salt was common, Gold was the precious commodity. The AP exam will sometimes give you a primary source from a traveler describing this inversion, and students who haven't internalized this concept will choose the wrong answer confidently. Enslaved people as a commodity. Precision in language matters. This is where you need both moral clarity and technical precision for the AP exam. Enslaved people were a significant commodity in the trans-Saharan trade, and the College Board expects you to analyze this with the same rigor you apply to any other commodity. West African rulers and merchants sold enslaved people, often war captives or individuals taken in raids, northward across the Sahara to North Africa and into the broader Islamic world. This is often called the trans-Saharan slave trade, and it predates the transatlantic slave trade by several centuries. The AP exam frequently asks students to compare this system to later forms of enslavement, especially the Atlantic slave trade covered in Unit 4. The critical distinctions are scale, racial codification, and the degree of dehumanization. The trans-Saharan system, while absolutely brutal and morally indefensible, was not organized around a racial ideology of permanent hereditary bondage in the same way the Atlantic system would become. Enslaved people in the Islamic world could sometimes earn freedom, hold positions of authority, or have their children born free. This is a comparison question waiting to happen on your FRQ or DBQ, so store it carefully. Always use the term enslaved people rather than slaves on your FRQ. The College Board's own rubrics reflect the contemporary historiographical standard, and using it signals to the reader that you understand the human dimension of this system, rather than treating it as purely a market abstraction. Timbuktu, Mali, and the architecture of power. Now let's talk about the cities and empires that made all of this possible. The Mali Empire, which flourished roughly from the 13th through the 15th centuries, was the dominant political force controlling trans-Saharan trade during this period. When AP students think Mali, three things must come to mind immediately: Mansa Musa, Timbuktu, and Islam. Timbuktu sits at a geographic sweet spot, the point where the Niger River bends northward, closest to the Sahara. Think of it as the Newark Airport of medieval West Africa. Not glamorous in itself, but positioned at exactly the right intersection of routes that everything had to flow through it. Caravans arriving from North Africa could offload salt and manufactured goods, pick up gold and enslaved people, and merchants could access the Niger River network to distribute goods deeper into the forest zones. Timbuktu became not just a trade hub, but an intellectual center, home to the Sankore Mosque and University, where Islamic scholarship flourished. This detail matters for the exam because it illustrates how trade routes facilitated the spread of Islam, a core AP theme connecting Unit 2 to the broader story of Islam's expansion across Afro-Eurasia. Mansa Musa, who ruled Mali in the early 14th century, is the figure who made Mali globally famous. His 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, was so lavishly provisioned with gold that historians believe he temporarily crashed the gold markets of Cairo and the Mediterranean world by flooding them with supply. That single event illustrates, in the most dramatic possible way, just how interconnected the medieval world's economies already were. A king traveling across Africa could cause inflation in Egypt. That's globalization, medieval style. The common student error here is confusing the Mali Empire with the later Songhai Empire, which replaced it and also controlled Timbuktu. For AP purposes, Mali comes first, 13th-15th century, Songhai comes after 15th-16th century, and Timbuktu threads through both as the great trading and learning city of the Western Sudan. Connecting to the big picture, for your FRQ responses, always frame this topic within the AP course's overarching themes: the development and expansion of networks of exchange, the role of environment and geography in shaping trade, the Sahara as both barrier and corridor, and how economic exchange drives cultural diffusion, specifically the spread of Islam. This section connects backward to Unit 1's coverage of pastoral and nomadic peoples, the Berber and Tuareg caravaneers who physically moved goods across the desert, and forward to Unit 4, where West African gold will reappear as a driver of European exploration and the eventual transatlantic trade system. With the patterns of the trans-Saharan world now mapped in your mind, we're ready to move into the Indian Ocean trade network, where many of the same dynamics, complementary commodities, cosmopolitan port cities, and religion traveling with merchants, play out on an even grander scale. 2.4b Role of camels and caravans in enabling Saharan crossing. Let's talk about one of the most underappreciated technological revolutions in world history. And no, it doesn't involve a microchip or a steam engine. It involves a large, bad-tempered, humped animal that smells terrible and bites. I'm talking about the camel, and if you want to score a 5 on this exam, you need to understand exactly why this creature changed the world. The camel is a technology. Here's the key conceptual move the AP exam wants you to make. Treat the domesticated camel not just as an animal, but as a technology, a tool that solved a specific problem and enabled something previously impossible. Before the widespread use of camels in trans-Saharan trade, the Sahara Desert was essentially a wall. It's the largest hot desert on Earth, stretching roughly 3,500 miles across northern Africa, and crossing it on foot or with horses or oxen was, practically speaking, a death sentence. Horses and oxen sweat heavily, require enormous quantities of water, and their hooves aren't built for loose sand. Think of it this way. Trying to cross the Sahara with a horse is like trying to cross the Pacific Ocean in a rowboat. Technically possible, practically suicidal. The camel changed that equation entirely. The dromedary camel, the one-humped variety domesticated in the Arabian Peninsula, was gradually introduced into North Africa beginning around 300 CE and became widespread in the Saharan trade context by roughly 700 to 800 CE, coinciding powerfully with the rise of Islam and the expansion of Islamic trade networks, a connection the AP exam loves. The camel's biological adaptations made it uniquely suited for desert travel. It stores fat, not water, as the common misconception goes, in its hump, can go up to 2 weeks without water under mild conditions, loses very little moisture through sweat, and its wide, padded feet act like natural snowshoes for sand. It can also carry loads of up to 400 to 500 pounds, making it an extraordinarily efficient cargo vehicle. The AP exam term you should know here is that the camel served as the ship of the desert. That's a phrase that has appeared in exam materials and captures the idea perfectly. Just as ships made oceanic trade possible, camels made Saharan trade possible. The caravan system. Now, the camel alone didn't transform trade. The organizational technology that mattered was the caravan, a structured group of merchants, guides, animals, and goods traveling together across the desert. Think of a caravan as a supply chain, a security detail, and a community all rolled into one. Traveling in a large group meant protection against bandits, shared knowledge of oases and routes, and the ability to pool resources in emergencies. A single merchant crossing the Sahara alone would be foolhardy. A caravan of 100 camels carrying gold, salt, slaves, and cloth? That's a viable commercial enterprise. The caravan routes connecting sub-Saharan West Africa to North Africa were among the most consequential trade corridors in the pre-modern world. The central exchange you must know cold for the exam is the gold-salt trade. West African kingdoms like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai sat atop enormous gold deposits in places like Bambouk and Bure, while North African and Saharan regions had vast salt deposits at places like Tegaza. Salt was not a luxury, it was a survival necessity in hot climates, used to preserve food and replace minerals lost through sweat. Gold, meanwhile, was the currency of Mediterranean and Islamic commerce. The two regions needed exactly what the other had, and camels and caravans provided the mechanism of exchange. This is supply and demand logic, made historical, and the AP exam expects you to explain why this trade happened, not just that it happened. Key cities and network nodes. The exam also wants you to know the urban infrastructure that grew around these routes. Cities like Timbuktu, Djenné, and Kumbi-Sala emerged as entrepôts, trading hubs where goods changed hands, merchants rested, and cultures mixed. Timbuktu, in particular, became not just a commercial center, but an intellectual one, home to the famous Sankore Mosque and University. This is an important nuance. The caravan trade didn't just move goods, it moved ideas, religions, and people. Islam spread across the Sahara largely along these trade routes carried by Muslim merchants from North Africa. When you see an AP question asking about the spread of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa, the answer almost always runs through the caravan network. Common MCQ traps and FRQ points. Here's where we sharpen your test-taking edge. The most common trap on this topic is the assumption that the camel was always present in North Africa. It wasn't. The domesticated camel arrived gradually after 300 CE, and the full flowering of trans-Saharan trade is really a post-700 CE phenomenon. If an MCQ presents an answer suggesting robust Saharan trade in, say, 100 BCE, that should raise a red flag. Another frequent trap is confusing the dromedary, one hump Arabian and North African context, with the Bactrian camel, two humps, Central Asian context. For the Silk Road's content in Unit 2, you'll see Bactrian camels. For the Saharan context, it's dromedaries, don't mix them up. For the FRQ, the College Board's rubric rewards causation and contextualization. It's not enough to say camels enabled trade. You need to explain how the camel's specific adaptation solved specific environmental obstacles, and you need to contextualize that by connecting it to the broader rise of Islamic commercial networks, the political power of Mali and Songhai, or the demand for gold in Afro-Eurasian markets. Students who score partial credit often describe the caravan trade accurately but fail to explain the mechanism that biological and organizational technologies together transformed a geographic barrier into a trade corridor. Connections across units. This topic threads through multiple units of the course. In Unit 1, you studied the West African kingdoms whose wealth derived from controlling these trade routes. In Unit 3, you'll see how the Mongol Empire similarly transformed overland trade in Eurasia. The caravan concept appears there too, just in a different geographic context. The broader theme the AP exam is testing across all of Unit 2 is that networks of exchange required enabling technologies, whether those are camels, ships, or road systems. Every time you see a trade network, ask yourself, what made this possible? The Saharan crossing story is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, finding the one biological tool perfectly adapted to an impossible environment, and building a civilization-changing trade system around it. With the Saharan routes now mapped in your mind, let's turn northward and eastward to examine the other great overland corridor of this era, the Silk Roads, and explore how a very different set of technologies and political structures enabled exchange across Central Asia. 2.5 Cultural Consequences of Connectivity. The big idea when worlds collide, cultures transform. Imagine you're at a food truck festival. You grab a Korean BBQ taco, Korean flavors wrapped in a Mexican tortilla, maybe drizzled with Japanese sriracha, served by a chef who learned to cook in New Orleans. That taco, that's cultural diffusion in a single bite. It's the product of connectivity, of trade routes, migration, and exchange bringing different people into contact until their ideas, beliefs, foods, and practices blend into something entirely new. That's exactly what we're talking about in 2.5, the cultural consequences that flow from the networks of exchange you've been studying throughout Unit 2. The College Board wants you to understand that trade doesn't just move silk and spices, it moves ideas, religions, diseases, and technologies. Every time a merchant caravan rolled along the Silk Roads, every time a dhow cut across the Indian Ocean, cultural cargo traveled alongside the commercial cargo. Your job on the AP exam is to recognize those cultural exchanges, explain how and why they spread, and analyze what changed and what didn't as a result. The spread of religion along trade routes. The single biggest cultural consequence of connectivity in this era is the spread of religion, and the AP exam will test this extensively. Think of the major universal religions, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, as the most successful franchise models in human history. They weren't tied to one ethnicity or one homeland. They were designed structurally to appeal across cultural lines, and trade networks were their delivery system. Buddhism spread from its South Asian origins outward along the Silk Roads into Central Asia, China, Korea, and eventually Japan. Merchants played a crucial role here. Buddhist monks would travel with caravans offering spiritual services and building monasteries at oasis towns along the route. The oasis town of Dunhuang in northwestern China became a remarkable crossroads where Buddhist art, manuscripts, and practices accumulated over centuries, a living museum of cultural diffusion. As you analyze this on the exam, remember the key dynamic. Merchants needed safe harbors and monasteries provided them. Religion and commerce reinforced each other. Islam spread in a strikingly similar pattern after the 7th century CE. Arab merchants already experienced Indian Ocean traders carried Islamic practice into East Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. The port cities of Kilwa on the Swahili coast of Malacca and Southeast Asia are your go-to examples here. Rulers in these commercial hubs often converted to Islam not purely out of spiritual conviction, but because it built trust with Muslim trading partners and connected them to an enormous, prosperous commercial network. This is a nuance the AP exam loves to test. Religion spreading through voluntary conversion driven partly by economic incentives, not conquest. Syncretism, the exam's favorite word. Here's where students lose points regularly, so pay close attention. When religions and cultural practices spread into new regions, they rarely arrive unchanged. Instead, they blend with local traditions to create something new. The AP term for this is syncretism, and you need to be able to define it, recognize it, and give examples. Think of it like a musical remix. The original song is still recognizable, but the new beat, the new instruments, the new verses, those come from the local culture absorbing and reshaping what arrived from outside. Sufism in West Africa blended Islamic worship with local spiritual practices. Buddhism in China absorbed elements of Taoism and Confucianism to create Chan Buddhism, which you might know better by its Japanese name, Zen. The Hindu temple architecture that appeared in Southeast Asian kingdoms like Angkor Wat fused Khmer artistic traditions with Indian religious concepts. In every case, the religion spread, but it changed as it traveled. The common MCQ trap here is assuming cultural diffusion means perfect replication. It doesn't. When you see a question asking why a religion practiced in Region B looks different from how it's practiced in its region of origin, the answer almost always involves syncretism or cultural adaptation, not failure or corruption of the original tradition. Don't be fooled. Technologies and crops on the move. Religion gets the headline, but technologies and agricultural products also moved along these networks in ways that transformed societies. The College Board specifically highlights a few you must know. Cold paper and printing technology spread westward from China along the Silk Roads, eventually reaching the Islamic world and then Europe, where it would, centuries later, supercharge the Protestant Reformation. Gunpowder, also Chinese in origin, diffused across Eurasia with enormous consequences for warfare and political power. Mathematical innovations, including the Hindu-Arabic numeral system and algebra, the word itself is Arabic, al-Jabr, moved from South Asia through the Islamic world into Europe, fundamentally reshaping science and commerce. On the agricultural side, new crops followed traders across the Indian Ocean world. Bananas and Asian yams spread into East Africa. Cotton cultivation expanded from South Asia into new regions. Sugar, originally from South Asia, spread into the Mediterranean world. These aren't trivial facts. They're evidence that connectivity reshaped what people ate, how they farmed, and ultimately how their economies functioned. Diseases, the darkest consequence of connectivity. No discussion of cultural consequences is complete without acknowledging that connectivity also spread disease, and this connects directly to Unit 4 when you hit the Columbian Exchange. In the context of Unit 2, the Black Death is your prime example. Bubonic plague traveled along the Mongol-facilitated Silk Roads in the 14th century, devastated Eurasia, and killed roughly a third of Europe's population. The cultural consequences were profound. Labor shortages empowered peasants. The authority of the church was questioned when prayer failed to stop the dying, and artistic traditions shifted toward themes of mortality. Disease, in other words, wasn't just a demographic event, it was a cultural earthquake. Connecting to the broader course. This topic is a cornerstone for everything that follows. When you get to Unit 3 and study the Mongol Empire, remember that the Mongols didn't just conquer, they created the most connected Eurasian network in history, accelerating all of these cultural exchanges and the disease transmission that came with them. When you reach Unit 4 and the Columbian Exchange, you're seeing 2.5 on a global scale, with the Americas now plugged into the network for the first time. And when Unit 6 brings industrial imperialism, you'll see European powers forcibly imposing their cultural practices on connected regions, a darker, coercive form of the same cultural diffusion process. The through line is always the same. When people connect, cultures change. Sometimes the change is a beautiful Korean barbecue taco. Sometimes it's the Black Death. The AP exam wants you to explain both with specificity, with the right vocabulary, and with an understanding that these consequences were rarely simple or one-directional. Coming up next, we'll shift our focus from the cultural consequences of exchange to the specific role that the Mongols played in reshaping those networks, and why their empire changed the world in ways that still echo today. 2.5a Spread of religion along trade routes: Islam, Buddhism, Christianity. The big picture: religion travels with merchants. Here's an analogy that might surprise you. Think about how a coffee shop chain spreads. It doesn't just appear everywhere at once. It follows highways, airports, and places where people already gather and exchange things. Religion in the pre-modern world worked almost exactly the same way. Merchants, pilgrims, and travelers carried their faiths like cargo along the same roads, sea lanes, and river systems they used to carry silk, spices, and porcelain. Your job for the AP exam is to understand not just that religion spread, but how, where, and what changed as they traveled. That distinction, process, geography, and cultural transformation is exactly what College Board is testing. Islam, the merchant faith. Islam is the clearest example of a religion that spread hand in hand with commerce, and the AP exam loves to test this. Founded in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century CE, Islam expanded with remarkable speed, not primarily through conquest, as many students mistakenly assume, but through merchant networks and Sufi missionaries. The Swahili coast of East Africa is your go-to example here. Arab and Persian merchants sailed the Indian Ocean using monsoon winds, a technology you should connect back to Unit 2's broader theme of Indian Ocean trade. And when they established trading posts from Mogadishu down to Kilwa, they brought Islam with them. Local elites along the coast often converted because adopting Islam gave them credibility and access to wider trade networks. Think of it like joining a professional association. Conversion was sometimes as much about economic opportunity as spiritual conviction. That nuance matters enormously on the SAQ and LEQ. The College Board also wants you to know about Sufis, the mystic practitioners of Islam who played an outsized role in spreading the faith across Central Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Sufis emphasized personal, spiritual experience and were flexible in incorporating local customs, which made Islam more accessible and less threatening to new communities. Write that word syncretism into your memory right now. Syncretism means the blending of two cultural or religious traditions into something new, and it appears constantly in AP World History. When Sufis allowed devotional practices that resembled local traditions, the result was a syncretic Islam that looked somewhat different in West Africa than it did in Arabia. Buddhism, the Silk Road traveler. Buddhism offers a slightly different story, and the contrast is important. Originating in the Indian subcontinent around the 5th century BCE, Buddhism spread most dramatically along the Silk Roads, the overland and maritime networks connecting East Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, and the Mediterranean world. By the 1st century CE, Buddhist monks and merchants were carrying texts, art, and ideas across the Taklamakan Desert through oasis cities like Dunhuang and Samarkand. Here's the memorable image. Imagine caravans stopping for the night at an oasis town, and while merchants traded goods in the market, Buddhist monks set up in a cave temple nearby, painting murals and converting locals. Dunhuang's famous cave murals are literally that scene preserved for 1,500 years. For the AP exam, you need to distinguish between the two main branches of Buddhism and their geographic spread. Theravada Buddhism traveled to Southeast Asia. Think Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, largely through maritime trade routes. Mahayana Buddhism spread northward and eastward into Central Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, carried by Silk Road merchants and missionaries. The College Board won't usually require you to name specific doctrinal differences, but knowing the geographic destination of each branch is testable. A critical concept here is cultural adaptation. As Buddhism moved into China, it blended with existing Confucian and Taoist traditions. The result was distinctly Chinese forms of Buddhism, and this is your second major example of syncretism. Common MCQ traps on this point try to get you to say Buddhism arrived in China and replaced local traditions. Push back on that instinct. The answer is almost always blending, not replacement. Christianity, Mediterranean and beyond. Christianity began as a small sect within Judaism in the Roman-controlled Eastern Mediterranean, and its early spread depended heavily on Roman infrastructure, roads, common language, Greek as a lingua franca, and the relative peace of the Pax Romana. This is a crucial connection to Unit 1's coverage of classical empires. The Roman road network functioned like the internet of the ancient world. It allowed ideas to travel as fast as people could walk or ride. When the Roman Empire eventually adopted